Well, let me say, with respect to South Sudan, um, the country, as a result of the peace agreement from August of last year, has an opportunity for a second chance. And there has been some significant progress toward implementing that agreement. There was the final conclusion on security arrangements that was reached in November of last year, and then the return of the opposition advance team in December, and finally the return of opposition leader Riek Machar in April. And since then, the Transitional Government of National Unity has been formed. There's still one piece missing in that, which is the Transitional National Legislative Assembly. But the government has started to, they appointed the ministers and began to work. There was a very encouraging set of meetings in early June between President Kiir, First Vice President Machar, and Vice President Wanaiga, where they set out a number of important steps for implementation, ending the state of emergency, releasing prisoners of war, establishing a commission to look into the 28 states, and I'll explain more about that in a minute. But the problem has been that since then, there has been really a lack of implementation, a lack of follow-up. And this is very concerning. And the peace agreement was, yes, it was an agreement between the warring factions, between the government and the opposition, but it also brought in some of the other political actors from the dominant political party, the SPLM, and it brought in other political groups as well. And during the negotiations, there were efforts to bring in the religious community and civil society and others. That worked to some extent, but there was a lot of resistance from the armed groups. They wanted to be the ones negotiating the peace. But thanks to the very solid, unified position of IGAD, which is the regional grouping in the Horn of Africa, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, and the African Union, particularly the 5 African Union countries that were selected to reinforce IGAD's efforts, and other international partners, including the United States, the United Kingdom, and Norway, that formed the so-called Troika, with the assistance of China, the European Union as well. That common position of all those international and regional partners was really critical in ensuring that the peace agreement didn't just reward the warring factions with positions in government, but also made sure the peace agreement had a significant reform agenda so that the South Sudanese state could actually be reformed and give South Sudan a chance of moving forward in peace and prosperity into the future. And those 4 reform agendas were one on the economic side, was to give greater transparency to public finances, to put an end to rampant corruption, to ensure that the resources of the country, which mainly have been from oil production, would be used to benefit the people of South Sudan. There was reform, if you will, on the social level through a reconciliation process, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but also a hybrid court to be organized between South Sudan and the African Union to look into accountability for those most responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity committed during the civil war in South Sudan. And there was also reform of the security sector, very important in South Sudan. South Sudan was created basically as a result of liberation movement in the 50-year struggle with the government in Khartoum. And so it became a country that was, from its very inception, a very militarized country with a very large armed force. And so the country needs to come up with a security architecture that it can afford and that really meets the needs of the country. So those, and then the 4th reform was actually the reform of the state itself, in that the peace agreement calls for the writing and adoption in a consultative manner of a new constitution for the country, so that elections that would occur at the end of the 30-month transition would occur under a new constitution. And this would enable the South Sudanese to decide on issues, for example, whether they want to have a federal structure, which was a major demand of the opposition during the peace negotiations, and also how the state would be subdivided into political jurisdictions. So I mentioned 28 states, and this is has been a very important issue. All during the peace negotiations, it was the opposition that was demanding that there be additional states created. And the government, backed by the international partners, all said this was too important an issue to be decided in a peace negotiation, that it was something that had to be done in a constitutional process. And yet, after the peace agreement was signed, it was President Kiir who announced out of the blue that they would be creating 28 states instead of the original 10. And this has created some really divisive political issues, and in particular along ethnic lines. And we saw an outbreak of violence in Malakal, where the Shilluk felt disenfranchised by these new 28 states, and has become a stumbling block, frankly, in implementation of the element of the peace agreement that dealt with power sharing at the state level. Because the opposition was to have the majority of state governments in a couple of the states in Greater Upper Nile. And now that instead of 10 states there are 28, this has put into question how that would be implemented. So one of the issues that President Kiir and Vice President Machar agreed on in their meetings in early June was to form a boundary commission. But that boundary commission has not been able to do anything because after they agreed to form it, they came to a disagreement over whether it would simply redraw boundaries of the current 28 states or whether it could actually increase or decrease the number of states. And until this issue is resolved, there will be continuing ethnic tensions in many parts of the country, as I mentioned in the Malakal area, but also in the Equatorias and other parts of the country.